We're aligning structure and function. That's our main goal. A couple of really important questions in terms of definitions. What are pathways? Because we'll have to talk about pathways. Pathway is a series of neurons responsible for carrying a specific type of information. So the following attributes may vary a great deal. The type of information, by definition, that will define a pathway. Is this a sensory pathway, for example, carrying a certain type of modality? So we already used the example of vibratory sense, fine touch, as opposed to pain and thermal, or a motor pathway, which would be a descending pathway, so descending going down, or ascending sensory pathways are going up, right? So type of information, that will determine what kind of pathway we're talking about. The length of pathway can vary a great deal. So there are short and long pathways. So how many synapses are involved can differ, and the actual physical length will differ a great deal. There will be so-called long pathways that I'm going to emphasize again and again and again, and it's very critical to know for every physician. Okay, the chemical coding of the pathway is really dependent on the particular pathway we talk about. And in some cases, it's so recognizable that you pretty much identify it by the nature of the neurotransmitter. So when you hear and use terms like the nigrostriatal dopaminergic pathway, of course, the one that goes from substantia nigra to the striatum in basal ganglia, substantia nigra in midbrain, whose degeneration is blamed for the development of Parkinson's disease and Parkinsonism, right? So I mean, it's so intricately linked to that neurotransmitter and that kind of specific interaction that goes from one place and it dumps its neurotransmitter content in another place, to put it very bluntly. Okay, whether the information reaches the level of conscious perception or not, naturally will vary a great deal. So there are a lot of unconscious mechanisms. So for example, so there is conscious proprioception that yes, I am aware of the position of my body parts and that sort of thing, and I'm consciously regulating, and yes, at the same time, and yet at the same time, there are automatic adjustments, and a lot of it is done by the work of the cerebellum. So that's kind of the non-conscious type of proprioception, for example, that goes behind the scenes. I'm not aware of it. You become keenly aware of it when there's dysfunction in the brain, and that's our link to our clinical illustrations and so-called cerebellar patient and the lack of coordination, okay, that sort of thing. So a lot more could be said about this. Very, very critical that you understand the basics. So functional systems are based on these pathways. So for example, the anterolateral system, this pain and thermal, dorsal column or posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, that's your vibratory sense and fine touch. And the corticospinal, now removing from the sensory pathways to a really large motor pathway, corticospinal or pyramidal tract. Okay, that would be descending rather than ascending, right? That would look like this, of course, and crosses the midline here. And these are sensory ones. So it's very, very important. So clinically, these are called the long pathways, long tracks, because they traverse many levels, and their damage produces repeatable pattern of lesion signs. So if I had a stroke here, then, and post-stroke, or okay, here, thinking of cortex, or internal capsule under the cortex, ventral part of my midbrain on that side, or ventral pons on that side, and then I move like this, paretic gait, okay, post-stroke syndrome. That's very repeatable. So you're going to see this again and again. All right, so motor deficits and sensory deficits, and usually contralateral if you're above the level of decussation in the case of a cross pathway. Because, by the way, that changes also based on the nature of the pathway. I should mention this, whether a pathway crosses the midline or not, and where, at what level does a pathway cross the midline. All right? And that's where our very pesky and scary-looking illustrations of cross-sections come in, and then you trace a pathway and see, oh, such and such will cross at this level, but another pathway which may be related crosses at another level. And of course, there might be dissociation between the deficit signs when you have a lesion at a certain level. In the case of one pathway, you get an ipsilateral deficit because it hasn't crossed yet. And in the case of the other pathway, you get a contralateral, meaning opposite-sided deficit when you look at the body deficit for this reason. So we need to be keenly aware, and eventually we're going to be developing this knowledge. Okay, having said that, what are reflexes? We need to know the definition of reflexes. A reflex is an involuntary response to a certain type of input. This is automatic, involuntary, even when a skeletal muscle target is involved. So, so classical stretch reflex, for example, a patellar tendon reflex, yeah, I see that, I sense that. When somebody were to tap my tendon here, I can't really consciously regulate it, and yet it uses skeletal muscle that I can move voluntarily, and yet these mechanisms are completely involuntary. Okay, and this happens to be the most commonly clinically examined type of reflex, myotatic stretch reflex or deep tendon reflex. So many names, deep tendon reflexes, because you passively stretch that muscle via the tendon. The clinical terms are areflexia, complete lack of reflex activity, hypo-reduced or hyper-reflexic person having abnormally high level of reflex activity. They can occur. Reflexes use pathways. Almost trivial to say, but we have to say it, which is really an interaction between the sensory and the motor pathway. There is some kind of interaction between them that will create a reflex. Okay? Note that all reflexes use pathways, but not all pathways code reflexes, right? So I talked to you about the amalgamation of the innate and learned mechanisms. There's something that's more complex. Of course, we'll use pathways, but it may be a higher order phenomenon, not a reflex. But very importantly, we learn to draw connections, especially in central nervous system, based on what we learn, and we kind of indicate a cell body of a neuron with a knob, and the line that leaves is the axon. This might indicate the fact that we're going through so many different levels, and this may be a long distance. So again, there are long pathways, there are shorter pathways, right? Owing to that nature. And then the little fork here is the axon terminal and the exaggerated synaptic gap, meaning an interaction with the next neuron in that chain. The little knob will indicate the cell body and the dendrites. And then its axon, it will do its own thing, right? Schematically represented. And of course, this would be a simple reflex. It's a monosynaptic reflex in this case. So our previously mentioned myotatic or stretch or deep tendon reflexes are like this. Monosynaptic, so the sensory neuron with its axon synapsing directly on a motor neuron, and the motor neuron axon is going to the periphery, to the motor ending, the motor end plate. So you would be looking for that neuromuscular junction at this end. So what are we doing? What we say that we closed a reflex loop in this case, right? All right? So I talked to you about the fact that there's interaction between sensory and motor, and it may be as simple as a single synapse, okay? And here's a pathway. Now, sensory neuron sitting in the periphery or first relay in central nervous system. Sure enough, this pathway crosses the midline, so there's a decussation at a certain point, right? And then relay in forebrain, so that's contralateral forebrain representation, thalamus and cortex. That's how you would depict the pathway. So, of course, we talked about this central and peripheral components, but this is going to be a big block diagram. Topographically, central and peripheral, functionally, sensory, motor, integrative components. And this is, in fact, what you look at clinically. So this is bread and butter for the clinician. Sensorium, motorium, and higher order. And you may not be looking at these in that particular order. I'll tell you more about this. And of course, Dr. Godet in other courses will tell you more about this. So from this, we get the concepts of reflex and a reflex arc, that closing the reflex loop that I mentioned. Also conceptualized, as you well know, as somatic and visceral nervous system based on the targets of motor innervation. So the somatic nervous system is innervating that skeletal musculature, right, on the motor side, and then visceral is going to be some kind of a gland or smooth muscle, and depending on where that smooth muscle is, bronchioles or arterioles, etc., or maybe your piloerector muscles, right? Depending on those, you'll get varying responses. So then it can be interpreted like this. So CNS here in the middle, periphery goes around in the periphery, naturally, information coming in, so all of that is afferent or sensory coming in, it gets interpreted into some kind of response that goes out in the motor side, and yes, it can be somatic or visceral, right? Depending on the nature of the target. That's our nervous system. And nevertheless, and you have seen this more than likely, in gross anatomy, the simplest possible model of the nervous system is just a cross-section of the thoracic spinal cord level, where you see this nice little spinal cord. Mind you, this is in the so-called anatomical or histologic orientation. So once again, we need to circle the wagons perhaps a little bit and think about what's where and what goes where. So the anatomical histologic orientation is like this. I'm standing in front of you in the anatomical position, and you, in an imaginary way, you cut me across. You cut me across, and you look at me. I'm facing you, so the ventral side is toward me, toward the bottom of the screen. This is histologic or anatomical orientation. The dorsal side or posterior side is pointing away from me. Now, in clinical imaging, in the axial sections, this will be flipped, turned around. Okay, we'll pay attention to that when we go to clinical images, but right now, the ventral side is facing the observer. So, which is to say that you have the dorsal root ganglia and dorsal rootlets going in posterior and dorsally. That's the sensory aspect, and the ventral aspect is the motor aspect, with the axons coming out, the motor axons in the ventral root. And of course, they become mixed at the formation of that spinal nerve, very proximal part of the spinal nerve, and this will go to the periphery, right? And we understand that the ventral aspects of spinal cord and the rootlets are related to motor mechanisms, and the dorsal posterior are related to sensory. So there's distinction between afferents and efferents in that sense. So you would have an imaginary arrow pointing in and an imaginary arrow pointing out, and this is probably the simplest representation of a type of nervous system. And of course, it looks like this, and the central processing is inside, by definition, the central nervous system. So the afferents, quote, sensory, are coming in. So for example, the 1A, this is Roman numeral 1, and then little a. So 1A, afferent is coming in from the muscle, a stretch reflex, for example, and it's not going to have an intraneuron. That's going to go directly to the motor neuron, and of course the efferent is the axon of the motor neuron. Efferent, or output, goes to the target, and that way we just close the reflex loop. So some other reflexes would have this intraneuron in between. Yeah? Some other reflexes, not your stretch reflex, and we'll learn about these. So we need to talk about the concept of afferent and efferent, because so far we have used afferents and efferents as being synonyms for sensory and motor, respectively. But there is a larger meaning to these, simply to say that you call anything afferent relative to a point where it's going to, afferent, going to, and then efferent, or output, and this may sound trivial, but believe me, it is not. When you take your other knowledge base and everything is mashed up, it's always a good idea to go back to basics and kind of, as my very good friend used to say, a very good neurologist, used to say, I learned to walk before I learned to run. So you walk before you run. So going back to that idea, afferent going to a point, efferent going away from a point, and this is very critical to understand, for example, in a pathway that has many neurons, and you're chasing and tracing a chain of neurons, and then you're so, oh, efferents going to this, afferents going there, and what are these? And of course, you plug in the neurotransmitter, you plug in the function, plug in the regulation of those, and it gets very, very complex. So the idea being that afferent and efferent in a series of neurons relative to a point. And we can do this regardless whether the information is sensory, motor, or integrative. You may be in an integrative system just analyzing pathways and synapses, and it's really removed from that immediate meaning. Is this sensory? Is it motor? It's neither. It's regulating something. We'll still have afferents and efferents. And you need to get the correct terminology. So if nucleus A, so we talked about nuclei as concentrations of cell bodies, right, in the central nervous system. And usually those neurons that are grouped together, they typically serve the similar or same kind of function. So in many cases, it is enough for me, and get this once again, it is enough for me to show one knob and one line going away, potentially representing thousands of neurons that are pretty much doing the same thing. Okay? Once again, maybe trivial, but I'm compelled to point this out. So that is nucleus A, and there may be thousands of these, but nucleus A is sending its efferents to nucleus B. Or from the perspective of nucleus A, so these are outputs. Okay? From the perspective of nucleus B is getting afferentation. It's getting afferents. It's getting input, needless to say, okay? Because they're going toward it. An input to nucleus B. And then you have the axons from B going to C. That's an output, an efferent. But that becomes afferent with an A to C. And there may be a final output of that pathway. If this is my pathway, final output is from nucleus C, I'm interested in that. So regionally and systemically, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the neurotransmitter. I'm interested in the fact whether it's excitatory or inhibitory, et cetera, what it does in a larger context. So speaking of regions of central nervous system, I'm going to speed this up. So we have regions that you can trace hierarchically from spinal cord to brainstem to forebrain. If you wanted to go from bottom to top, or you would go from top to bottom the same way. If you look at the spinal cord, of course, links peripheral nervous system to the brain, right? Sometimes we have these peripheral nerve plexuses, that sort of thing. Things coming and going. And this is spinal cord cross-section, of course. The white matter is outside, gray matter inside. The spinal nerve roots are attached to these segments of spinal cord. So this is where we have that ladder-like segmentation, rungs of a ladder that I can climb up and down. It organizes reflex activity. Very, very important that we learn about spinal reflexes, and we will be. The white matter has ascending, going up, and descending, going down pathways. So it's like if you ever looked at an elevator in a large building, you may have seen those cables coming up and down. Wow, that's my tracks, pathways going up and down the white matter. Okay, so neatly organized. Again, clinically very repeatable patterns of lesion signs when they get damaged. So now we're going from spinal cord to brainstem, medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain, infratentorial in localization, meaning that it is below the tentorium cerebelli, that dural partition that we call tentorium cerebelli. Brainstem and cerebellum are below it. Forebrain are above it. So these are infratentorial. Medulla oblongata is really the rostral continuation of our spinal cord. Again, ascending, descending tracts. Intrinsic stuff having to do with cranial nerves, having to do with cardiorespiratory centers. Very, very important. Pons also has cranial nerve nuclei. Pontine nuclei link cortex. So pontine nuclei down here, cortex to cerebellum, very important integrative centers are formed that way. So that describes our pons. Midbrain, which is here, small but important, kind of in between the end of brainstem, beginning of forebrain. That's where, by the way, that change occurs. The flexure in the inclination of the long axis is occurring gradually. So there will be intermediate levels where you cut a section and you see a little bit forebrain, a lot of midbrain, and then more forebrain, and you're going to that coronal cut. Just to finish up some ideas left over from our previous discussion, right? So it's happening here, right here, this midbrain. Again, it has some cranial nerve nuclei, third and fourth, oculomotor and trochlear, made up by central core and base. Central core, generally speaking, is very, very important in the brainstem. It has a lot of neurons. Many of them are chemically coded. You may have heard about this so-called reticular formation. We'll talk a lot more about this. I'm kind of recognizing general theme here that there are cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem, and also there are integrative mechanisms in the brainstem, and pathways still going up and down. So there's very important what's known as conduit functions. Just like we had that in the spinal cord, pathways going up and down, conduit functions, like very much literally, look at this cable here. If we were to analyze the content of all of these cables here, that's our equivalence of afferents and efferents, and going in various directions. We have that in the spinal cord. We surely have that in the brainstem. Okay? Very, very critical to understand. Cerebellum is also infratentorial. Topographically, the cerebellum is very close to brainstem, and yet it is considered as a separate system. It receives highly processed sensory information, and it has modules of functions regulating motor input, actually acting on spinal cord motor centers and forebrain motor centers. And we'll learn more about this under the cerebellum in its own right. It's a 2-hour topic, very, very detailed. Long story short, it is important for sensory motor integration. So-called cerebellar signs, when you look at a patient with cerebellar damage, complete breakdown of the rhythmicity and the coordination of movement will result from that. Very, very good. The forebrain, importantly, is above tentorium cerebellaris. So your forebrain, also known as prosencephalon in embryologic terms, right? Telencephalon and diencephalon. So your gray and this darker pink together, that's your forebrain, supratentorial. So the diencephalon is divided into these nuclei. So you have nuclei in the thalamus, nuclei in the hypothalamus, doing their own thing. Very, very important things. Linking brainstem and cerebral hemispheres, a lot of processing takes place in thalamus and hypothalamus. And then cerebral hemispheres, a cortex, the word cortex is really referencing bark of a tree. Okay, so that's kind of an outer layer. And then there is white matter underneath it and subcortical gray matter. In most cases, you would be referring to those as basal ganglia. So deep gray, so those nuclei, concentration of neurons, thousands of neurons, as I mentioned before, serving pretty much the same functions, and they live together, they work together. So those are nuclei, the gray that would stand out, but deep in that telencephalon, deep in that forebrain. And white matter tracts are located just underneath the cortex, but then they can be organized in a system that's really funneling down toward the brainstem and deeper areas of the brain. So what I'm pointing at, you don't have to know the name right now, but it's going to be very important for you that eventually that you recognize, that you learn it. It's called internal capsule. All right? I did mention capsular stroke when I was doing little gymnastics showing various types of pyramidal tract damage, corticospinal tract damage. Cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are numbered from Roman numeral 1 to 12. 1 olfactory and 2 optic are really tracts of central nervous system. They are not true nerves. They're not peripheral in any way. 3 through 12 are indeed attached to the brainstem and act as true nerves. They go to the periphery. In your study of anatomy, you will consider them in their peripheral distribution. In neuroscience, we'll go inside, we'll look at the origins and destinations of those pathways, so to speak. Are you with me? Origins and destinations, depending on when you have those cranial nerve nuclei embedded in the brainstem, and through 3 through 12 are in brainstem. A cluster of neurons, its origin, if it's a motor, pointing out, okay, sending output through cranial nerves, because some cranial nerves are purely motor, some others are purely sensory, so I'm expecting a, quote, destination in central nervous system when that sensory input comes in, okay, where will it go? To a cranial nerve nucleus. It will be somewhere in brainstem. We'll be climbing rungs of a ladder, but in a more sophisticated way than in the spinal cord. When we are in the brainstem, we will be kind of going up and down in a similar fashion. And then there will be cranial nerves that are mixed, meaning they have both sensory and motor components. And some of our cranial nerves have autonomic components. And we talked about this, and we will be talking again and again about these as the cranial division of our craniosacral outflow of the parasympathetics, right? So cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10 have autonomic motor, aka, in this case, parasympathetic component. More about this later. Again, I'm literally holding the floodgates from opening. I'm just giving you a little glimpse. Okay, we're not opening up the floodgates. The big take-home message is that this is my view of the brain. It's just like the highway system of the United States, for example. So you have systems and regions, and eventually we need to understand them together. So your pathways are really the highways, okay? Whether it's going north and south, east and west and east, that will identify a pathway. And of course, pathways will identify systems and functions. And then, just like in the United States, you go through the various states, we go through various portions of the brain and spinal cord. And eventually you will understand both of these. So merging our regional and systemic knowledge, when your knowledge is more advanced. But of course, we walk before we run, okay? And you might have to take baby steps first, and then you're gonna gain more confidence. Which brings up the systemic and regional neurobiology, the somatic motor system, and somatic sensory system carrying 2 types of modalities here. So these are important neuroanatomical and neuroscientific keywords that I collected here. We need to know the definition of central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. I trust you know the definitions. Ipsilateral, contralateral, same side or opposite side relative to where you see the function and dysfunction in the body, or head and neck and face, and whatever it may be. A commissure, okay, and maybe new. A connection between left and right side of the brain of the same territories. That's a commissure, a white matter commissure. Decussation, I talked about that. That would be a pathway crossing the midline at a certain point, when you're tracing a pathway. Nerve fibers, just another name for axons. Projection, very important neuroscientific term. Like shooting an arrow, that's a projection. A neuron sending an axon to its termination. I call it projection. So such and such neuron projects to such and such, and it has a certain neurotransmitter, and then of course I'm expecting a certain function in that territory where the axons terminate. Well, that little fork is. There you have the drawing, right? Okay, awesome. Synapse. We need to know what a synapse is and the various types, okay? White and gray matter. You may want to keep in mind that the gray matter contains variable amount of myelin, okay? So the gray matter is not just neurons. It has some fibers as well, but the white matter really stands out by the massive congregation of myelinated axons. And these are visible features of cerebral cortex that we'll talk about. Nucleus, you know what a nucleus is. Concentration of nerve cell bodies in the central nervous system, and the tract is central white matter with connections, okay? The concept of afferent, efferent again. Modality, I talked to you about modalities, the various types. So modality is just a word to say a type. A type, mainly in sensory systems, describing various classes of information, and we have somatotopic maps that can be built. So our first look at functional systems, because we'll have so many lectures going into the details, let's look at these, the motor and sensory pathways. So at our first blush, most of them are topographically organized. So it's just to say they display a somatotopic map. And this will be evident as we move on. Okay, so for example, the main motor pathways. I'm showing you the example of the biggest one, which is pyramidal tract, coricospinal tract. Critical. And for the fine, voluntary, fractionated movement of limbs. It's very, very dogmatic when I say this. And it's kind of good to learn it that way. Also known as pyramidal tract. Contains the upper and the lower motor neurons. So the upper motor neuron, the little knob is sitting here. All of this is an axon, and it crosses the midline in the pyramidal decussation medulla in the medullary pyramid. Okay, and the spinomedullary junction. And then it goes down as the lateral coricospinal tract in a very distinct localization in the white matter of spinal cord, and it will make a synapse. So these are upper motor neuron axons, okay, axons, and making a synapse here onto the lower motor neuron. That's the big, typically large motor neuron of the ventral horn. So all of these, once again, so these sections are in histologic orientation or anatomical orientation, and we have a cross-section of forebrain up here, and we just traced, congratulations, our first pathway, okay? And it decussates, as I mentioned before. So lesions of it cause contralateral, meaning opposite-sided weakness. There are other motor pathways, for example, brainstem spinal cord projective systems, holding back the floodgates. Again, I'll open it up a little bit when we get into those topics. But this is great. This is very important to get you started here. The primary motor and somatosensory areas of the cortex are somatotopically organized. So when you start your information on the motor side, or when you end for the first time, and that's why it's called primary, the first station in the cortex, okay, for the sensory, there are distinct regions that are recruited based on the localization of body parts. And they are surprisingly similar for the motor, which is in precentral gyrus, and the sensory, which is in postcentral gyrus of a parietal lobe. Precentral gyrus for motor is, of course, in frontal lobe, and it will go, even both of these will go into the medial surface that we cannot even see from here. So these are so-called homunculi, the recruitment of neuronal activation patterns in that cortex. And it's a disproportionate map because there are more neurons associated with certain body parts than some others. But it's a very repeatable pattern. Of course, we're going to line these up with the blood supply later on, because there will be distinct blood supply to all of these regions that will explain some of the deficits. The motor output is regulated by basal ganglia and cerebellum. They primarily influence upper motor neurons. And the basal ganglia, as well as the cerebellum, they both engage in looping circuitry, and in many cases they influence the cortex. But looping circuitry, but they are distinct, of course. So there is one for cerebellum, or several of them for cerebellum, and there are loops for basal ganglia. So remember, those basal ganglia are deep gray matter in forebrain. Okay, once again, big sigh there. Deep gray matter in telencephalon, in forebrain. Okay, why are they important? Again, they are unsung heroes of our nervous system. You don't even know how they operate and they exist until and unless there's dysfunction, and it becomes obvious and painfully obvious to the observer. Something is wrong. Basal ganglia, movement initiation and motor program selection. Cerebellum, the large context is sensory motor integration, coordination, movement. So both will regulate posture and locomotion. So all of this so that motorium can be expressed harmoniously and properly regulated. So the main sensor systems, and I just talk about somatosensory, general sensation from body. Of course, sensation from face, oral cavity, nasal cavity is carried by trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve is cranial nerve 5. It will also have a relay in the thalamus, and it will have that face region that you saw earlier in the cortex being recruited for it. We'll talk about it in due course. But right now, the posterior column, or dorsal column, medial lemniscus sensory pathway, is responsible for vibration and joint position sense. So the information is coming in here, and there are primary afferents coming in. The first synapse happens to be in the medulla, where that second order neuron, the axons, cross the midline, and then we go into thalamus and then cortex. And then for pain and temperature, so nociceptive input and temperature, so we have the information coming in, first order neuron, and the second order neuron, which is the central nervous system, is going to be at the spinal cord, and there is decussation at this level. So remember, there is decussation up here, but there's already decussation for this modality down at the spinal cord level, a so-called spinothalamic tract. And the naming of the tracts, by the way, in many cases, the naming of a tract will tell you the beginning and the end of a tract. So it makes a lot of sense to pay attention to the names and learn the names. Spinothalamic will tell you origin and destination, from the spinal cord all the way to thalamus, VPL, ventral posterior lateral nucleus of thalamus, which is my next point, forebrain representation of primary somatosensory information in thalamus and cortex. So a thalamus is regarded as, generally speaking, as a gateway to cerebral cortex. So much that eventually reaches cortex will have to go through thalamus first. Not everything, but many things. Okay, there's the so-called relay in sensation. That's a term we use. And the thalamic nuclei, because organized in distinct little blobs, nuclei, groups of neurons, they serve as relay. And specifically a VPL, ventroposterior lateral nuclei, will serve as somatosensory relay from body. VPM, by the way, is the same for the face and oral nasal cavities for the trigeminal type of information. So we're not going to forget it. We'll remind you of that when we get to that topic. So, and once again, we have our primary somatosensory cortex in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. And once again, just like the motor, it is also somatotopically organized. And we have a disproportionate representation of these body parts, face and the lips and that sort of thing. And look at the hand, and the thumb gets a disproportionately high number of neurons associated with it. Okay, so which is to say, from any kind of relay in the thalamus, get this, and we'll come back to it again and again, and please get this from now on. Neurons of a relay nucleus will project to the cortex. So a relay in the thalamus, in these areas, for example, the VPL, they will project to post-central gyrus. And now you know what the term projection means, right? Okay, so one of our big goals, one of the largest goals here in the first 2 hours that we just had is to build vocabulary. And with that, I will see you next time.